Good evening. You are listening to Radio Free Magonia, the official podcast of the Magonian Research Group. That's Magonian Research Group, MRG, and no, that's not a food additive. Tonight, we will not be discussing the unexplained. We are moving into the realm of organized crime, specifically in the area of Boston, Massachusetts, in the mid to late 20th century. My guest tonight is James.
Hi, Michael.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we begin, I want to go over my personal background in regards to this topic. I've been a true crime buff, true crime nerd as far back as I can remember. I've never focused specifically on Boston, at least not any more than any other city or any other area. But I am conversant. I am somewhat familiar.
Okay, good.
With it. So let's just start where it starts. Where does it start for you?
Well, Boston is so different than a lot of other cities. In Boston, there's always been a major Irish organized crime faction. I shouldn't even say one faction. There's been quite a few throughout the years. So that's that. Philly has had that. New York has had it. But Boston, the difference is that the Irish has pretty much been the equivalent to the Italians. They've been equals. At some point, the Italians certainly had the edge, but through the 60s, 70s, especially the 80s, the Irish definitely stood above the Italians in the Boston area.
Yeah, and I have a comment on that. For me, the closest urban area is Chicago, and Irish or Irish descended organized crime was stamped out there pretty fast. Whereas it seems in the Northeast, in Boston especially, it continued to prosper well past the Prohibition era. You had the K&E gang in Philadelphia, you had the Westies in New York City, and a deluge in Boston. So let's keep going.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot, like you said, a lot was stomped out around Prohibition era, but through here in Boston, they really thrived, and I think some of it has to do with just the neighborhoods in Boston are so diverse, from South Boston, North End, East Boston. Everyone was rather ethnic, and it was broken down by ethnicities, but also there were, and I'm sure this was the case in many other cities, but Boston had a lot of Irish cops, and they had a lot of friends, and deals were made. So that certainly gave them an edge sometimes. But up until I'd say probably the 50s, the Boston Irish really weren't, I wouldn't even say they weren't in the same league more or less as the Italians. The Italians definitely had the upper hand, but then things changed really quickly after that. And what we've seen, I'm sure you're familiar with the whole Whitey Bulger thing.
Yeah.
That all that blew up, and Bulger, you can trace his roots through some of the things I'm sure we'll be talking about today. Winter Hill Gang. We hear Winter Hill Gang. People think many things, but it's rather, unless you know the ins and outs, it's kind of confusing. There were more or less three Winter Hill Gangs separately. I don't want to say three separate at the same time, but more or less three, like not generations, but time periods. And he was tied to two, but before Bulger, there definitely was, organized crime. And one more thing I just want to touch upon is that they always say Winter Hill was the Irish Mafia, Irish mob. While some of the main guys were Irish, quite a few weren't. Some of the major guys were Italian, were Middle Eastern, Syrian, stuff like that.
It was my understanding that Stephen Flemmi and Martoriano were both half Italian paternally.
Yeah, Flemmi, from what I understand, in fact, we just had that discussion the other day recently, but Flemmi, from what I understand, was full Italian, but you're right, Martorano, his brother, Jimmy Martorano, and Johnny Martorano. Johnny was definitely the bigger out of the two. He was legendary.
I've heard different things about Flemmi. I know his mother's maiden name was Miserville, which it most definitely is not Italian.
Yeah, that's news to me. I mean, very, very well could be. I didn't know that.
But
I
he
know
looks fully Italian, and he has an Italian surname.
you're right about that. Absolutely. Um, and it's funny because in Boston, I don't know what the rules are across the country, but you look at a guy like Frank Salemi, who ended up becoming boss of the Cosa Nostra here.
Mm-hmm.
He was half Italian. His mother's, I think it was Mclaughlin, was her maiden name.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up making his son, he married a Jewish guy. Salemi Sr. Ended up married a Jewish lady, I should say. So his son was a quarter Italian. He ended up getting made. So the rules in Boston, I don't know if they just different or if they didn't observe them, but things weren't quite what they were in New York.
Yeah. Although Gotti loosened the standards somewhat, it seemed, or he was
Yeah,
less concerned with the division between associates and members.
absolutely. You're right. Yep.
Yeah.
You look at his son even getting made and being a captain, and no, you're right. Yep.
Yeah. He seemed to chafe at ethnic I want to say divisions, but ethnic stipulations, ethnic
Yes.
dictates. Like, he would have made Cutler in a
Yes. Yeah.
heartbeat,
Yeah. If you exactly.
not for his last
That's
name,
funny.
things
Yeah.
like that. So moving on, I want to touch on Bulger right away. I must say the last decade within the true crime community has really been the decade of Bulger.
Yeah.
Between his capture, his conviction, his murder, the flood of Howie Carr books on
Yeah.
him, the film adaptation, the this and the that. I feel kind of like we're at peak saturation with him.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
feel you'll obviously we have to touch on him
Sure.
in this, but we don't have to we don't really have to dwell on him extensively. So let's where does it start for you? The earliest to your
Let me
experience.
let me just say one thing. I don't want to say I have any expertise, but my knowledge is certainly Boston. And if you want to get even tighter, it's Winter Hill Gang Boston. You want to get even a bit more into it, it's the Somerville faction of the Winter Hill Gang, which was Winter Hill is a neighborhood in Somerville, which is a suburb of Boston. So Bulger was from South Boston. He ended up hooking up with the Somerville crew, and I can get into that later about what happened there and how he was brought in. But before that, he certainly was running around South Boston. South Boston was full of gangs, so many. I mean, like I think they said on every street corner there was a different gang, and it was amazing. And started out tailgating, stealing out back of trucks. Um, he really also got into bank robbery big time, and that's really what got him his first few scores. But I've spoken to guys who knew him back in the 40s and 50s. I don't want to name one of his names. He just passed away recently, but regardless, he was telling me that Bulger really wasn't a big deal. He was nothing back in the day. He really wasn't anything that special. He ended up becoming something very special, but he was just one of the guys, running around. He was in the gang originally called the Shamrocks,
Mm-hmm.
and that ended up being his start as far as his gang.
Yeah.
But he ended up going to prison over bank robbery, coming out, hooking up with what was known as the Colleen gang,
Mm-hmm.
Donnie Colleen, and they were essentially a gang of bookies and loan sharks.
Mm-hmm.
Bulger was their muscle. And that was when he got out of prison, I believe it was 65. His brother got him a job as a custodian at a courthouse, ironically, in a courthouse. But that was just for paper, just to show you had a job. He was definitely out there. So, yeah, I mean,
So this Colleen gang, how many members were there at the time?
yeah, it's funny because when you say members, it gets fuzzy because there were active members, there were associates.
Mm-hmm.
For the Colleens, I would say, there was Donnie, there was who was the head, and his brother. I forget his brother's name. I apologize, but I would say honestly, there was about 12 to 15. I would say hardcore members, and
Mm-hmm.
they had all the gambling. They had the horse racing, the dog racing, the numbers. They were out of a place called the Transit Cafe out on out in South Boston on Broadway. Transit Cafe ended up becoming Triple O's later. And that became Bulger's bar, Bulger's Hangout. But so it's he started out at when it was called the Transit Cafe, and Donnie Colleen owned it. So yeah, to answer your question, there was about, I'd say, 12 to 15 hardcore members.
And what was their structure?
And this is where the Irish, and these guys were all Irish. You can call this the Irish mob. They were all Irish. This is where the Irish differ, is that there wasn't, Donnie was the boss, but other than that, there really wasn't, okay, he has an underboss or he has a lieutenant. They were all guys just came in and either, turned in the collections to him. His brother headed did the bar work himself. He was the bartender, but also helped out in the loan sharking. The killing, the murder, eventually went to Bulger, went to a couple of other guys. Right now his name slipped my head, but he was out of Dorchester, a guy named Billy. I'm sorry, his name slipped my mind, but he worked at Bulger throughout the late 60s, and they were the muscle when things started to get or had to get rough. They were the guys, but there wasn't actually an organization. I don't want to say, there was a hierarchy. Donnie was the boss, but other than that, his brother Kenny was big. Kenny Colleen was in there, and that's really how they broke it down. And they were leading things pretty much until the late 60s, when another Boston or South Boston gang came on board, and more or less gave them a run for their money. If you want, I could go over that, but that affects a lot. This is what more or less got Bulger into the limelight. This gang war. There were two Boston Irish gang wars. One in the early 60s, mid 60s, and then this one late 60s, early 70s.
Okay,
very different.
Between the Colleens and who?
The Colleens and the Mullen Gang.
And
the Mullen Gang was very different. Whereas the Colleens were older guys, they were gamblers, they were loan sharks. The Mullens were B&E guys, breaking and entering. They were younger. A lot of them were Vietnam vets. Guys like Pat Nee. He's actually still around South Boston, believe it or not. Pat Nee's still running around. But Pat Nee started out with the Mullens. The Mullen Gang themselves actually goes back to the early 50s. There was a corner on East 3rd Street, and it was a guy named Mullen was in World War I, and they had a commemorative corner, so they named themselves after him. They thought it sounded like a good Irish name, so they were known as the Mullen Gang, and they were very, very rough. They were capable. Like I said, some of them were Vietnam vets, and they were tough kids. They were really tough guys, and they gave the Colleens a run for their money.
No, it's interesting to point out that all this took place in, as you say, South Boston.
That's right. Yep.
Which, to my understanding, is not a large area.
That's exactly right.
Like 1 square mile.
Charlestown's exactly 1 square mile. Southie's a little bit bigger, but I wouldn't say much. Christ, you could walk South Boston, from edge to edge, and maybe an hour and a half. It's not big at all when you think about it. If you look on the map, it's pretty much a grid laid out, but it's not big at all, and that's why all this happening back then was amazing. There were bodies being left. There were a lot of violence. A lot of things happened.
So the level of crime was disproportionate to its actual size, and that's interesting.
Yeah.
So where does Winter Hill fit into all this? I know Howie Winter was on the scene at the time.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yep. So all right, let me lay it out like this for you. Let's go back to, say, Boston, 1959. Let's do 1961. I'm sorry. Let's say 61. So Boston in 61 was very, very different than Boston in 71. So Boston 61, you had in the North End, there was the Mafia, LCN. They're headed by the Angiulos at that time. Jerry Angiulo had just become boss of Boston around that time. He reported to Patriarcha in Providence. But the Boston branch of the Patriarcha family wasn't that big. Not that many made guys, and many of them, as Jerry used to like to say, many of them just want to play left field and just do nothing. They did a hit back in '48, and that's it. They ride their name for the rest of their lives. So they had to lean on the Irish to get work done, and a lot of that was a crew out of Charlestown called the Mclaughlin Mob, Gang. They were headed by Bernie Mclaughlin, brothers Bernie Mclaughlin, Edward Punchy Mclaughlin, and George Mclaughlin. They had a lot of guys with them. And again, guys, we discussed Charlestown is very small. I think it's literally 1 square mile. But they had the docks there. So that's pretty much where they got their money. Robbing it, they also had the gambling and loan sharking on the docks. Charlestown is right next to Somerville. And Somerville, as I said, is where Winter Hill was, the neighborhood of Winter Hill. Around that time in Winter Hill in Somerville, you had a crew with Buddy McLean. James Buddy McLean was the leader. And as you mentioned, Howie Winter was part of that. They were childhood friends. They came up. Joe McDonald, I don't know if you're familiar with Joe McDonald. He was an older member of the Winter Hill Gang, but he was a mentor to Buddy McLean. And Joe actually ran the rackets in Somerville. He had to go away to prison. Buddy stepped up, ran it for him, and actually enlarged it. And when he came home in around 61, when Joe McDonald came home in 61, Buddy really had a lot of things wrapped up. Buddy was a really charismatic guy, but a very tough guy. I mean, hand-to-hand tough. This guy, legendary as far as street fights. The stories I've heard of this guy is it's unbelievable. So he more or less put Somerville on the map. And they, the news called them the Winter Hill Gang, but they were known as Somerville all the time, not Winter Hill Gang. They might call them the Hill. They hung out there, but they didn't really call them the Winter Hill Gang back then. So you had them. Also in Boston, you had, I don't know if you ever heard of Joe Barboza, but you had Barboza's crew. And he was friends at Winter Hill. Howie Winter, Buddy McLean, they all liked Joe, but Joe had a crew over in East Boston, his own crew. Joe was a very capable guy. They called him the Animal. He was a killer. He had some other guys with him that did a lot of killing as well.
It was my understanding that he was particularly partnered with Vincent Flemmi.
That's exactly right. Yep. Vincent the Bear Flemmi. And that brings in another crew because Vincent, or they always called him Jimmy Flemmi. Jimmy Flemmi was out of Roxbury, and he was part of a crew that Edward Wimpy Bennett led. And in that gang, you had the Flemmi brothers, Steve, you had Jimmy Flemmi, you had Frank Salemi, a couple guys, Peter Poulos, who was a Greek guy. Bennett had 2 other brothers, and so you had them. So they were just known as the Bennett Gang. They were out of Roxbury. So you had all these different crews, and then at the same time, you had South Boston guys. You had Killeen Gang. You had a lot of so it was a lot going on at that time.
That's what makes the area's criminal history stand out, is that these gangs were very fluid. These cliques were very fluid. You had shifts.
Yep.
It was always in flux, and it wasn't clearly defined by ethnicity.
That's exactly right.
Whereas in other cities, the history is very straightforward, very linear with clear divisions. Boston, it's a mess.
Yep, that's a great way to put it. And what a lot of the time, what they would call themselves are the independents. The independents would group together. Now, the independents would be Somerville's Winter Hill Gang, the Barboza Gang, Wimpy Bennett's gang. They'd all get together as a force and in more or less not stand up to Angiulo, but at one time, Angiulo wanted to kill Barboza, and all the independents got together. They actually put it down on paper, and I think there were 72 or 74 signatures saying that if Barboza was killed, each one of these guys would avenge his death with their life. After that, Angiulo backed away. So they would group together. They were very fluid. They were friends, a lot of them. All up until a weekend in 1961, which started the Winter Hill, or excuse me, the Irish Gang War. So up until then, they got along, but then things changed very quickly, and believe it or not, it started over a woman. It wasn't even business. It just started over a woman. So I mean, I can go into that if you'd like, as far as the whole gang war. It is a little bit lengthy, so if I carry on, stop me. But I'll try to sum it up as best. So in Massachusetts, there's a place called Salisbury Beach. It's right on the border of New Hampshire, and every Labor Day, I don't want to say all the independents, but the Somerville crew, Buddy, his guys, the Mclaughlin Gang, all Charlestown guys would all go up to Salisbury Beach. Believe it or not, guys from Somerville and Charlestown still do it to this day. These guys' grandsons are still in the mix, going up there. I'm not saying they're criminals, that, today they're roofers, they're doing stuff, but that's where they go on Labor Day. So in Labor Day 61, this happened, and they're all up there drinking as usual. And there was a party at a beach cabin, I guess you'd call it. And George Mclaughlin got drunk. Again, he's one of the Mclaughlin brothers from Charlestown. He got drunk and grabbed the breasts of a Winter Hill guy named Billy Hickey, his wife. He grabbed Billy Hickey's wife's breasts. And,
not Billy Hickey's.
No, exactly. Not Billy Hickey's. No. He grabbed Billy Hickey's wife's breast. I forget her name. I used to know her name. I've seen her much. She was a beautiful woman. But he crossed the line. He grabbed it. I guess all night he had been making remarks about her, just crossed the line. They gave him a few verbal warnings. When he grabbed it, 3 guys total ended up jumping him, and they beat the hell out of George Mclaughlin. They beat him badly, and they beat him so bad they thought he was dead. They rolled him up in a rug, and they dropped him off at the hospital over, I forget the town it was the nearest hospital. They just dropped him off, and he was in the hospital for weeks and weeks. But that really upset his brothers, and his brothers went over and saw Buddy McLean and said, we want Hickey, we want the other guys, we want them dead. What they did to George, blah blah blah. And Buddy was a very loyal guy. If he loved you, he loved you. He went to the end for you. So he said, what George did. George was out of line, and we're not going to kill these guys. He did actually, from what I understand, I heard this later, he did try to make amends by giving money. I don't know exactly. I was trying to find out how much. I don't know how much, but he tried to say, we'll pay for the hospital. We'll throw some money to you guys. And they said no, blah, 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 and left. October 30th, 1961, Buddy wakes up one night. He hears something at his car. He looks out and he sees there's 3 guys under the hood. His hood's popped. He runs outside. He grabs his gun. He actually does shoot at them. They run away, and he finds sticks of dynamite. I think it was 3 sticks of dynamite. I have the picture of it, and I think it's three sticks. So anyway, that really upset him because his wife was supposed to take the car the next day to drive the kids to school, and she would have been the one that started up. That was it for him. That was on the 30th, and that next day he went over, and he had a guy by the name of Russell Nicholson drive him over, and with him on his partner was a guy named Alexander Petricone. They called him Bobo Petricone. Now, Bobo ended up becoming the actor, changed his name to Alex Rocco, and he became Mo Green in The Godfather. Mm-hmm. So the guy who played Mo Green was an actual member of the Winter Hill Gang. He was from Somerville, and he went over with Buddy. It was, I think, 12:30 in Charlestown. Buddy walked up to Bernie Mclaughlin, shot him in the head. He handed the gun to Bobo. They went separate ways, and they drove back to Somerville. They ended up, I'm not sure the specifics, but they ended up meeting up, and they were arrested probably, I think, within the hour. They were arrested, charged with murder, all 3 of them. And so that more or less started the Irish gang war. The charges were eventually dropped because out of 70 people, there was only 2 people who said they saw something. One of them was killed, a guy by the name of George Joint. They called him Ox. He was out of Somerville, but he lived in Somerville, but he was a Charlestown guy, so he was going to say how Buddy killed him. They killed Ox Joint. They threatened a stripper who was going to talk as well, and then after that, there were nobody was talking, so the charges were dropped. But that set everything up. That's how it all started.
And it seems that certain figures like Barboza, like Vincent Flemmi, checked out of this scene pretty fast.
Yeah.
Really
Absolutely.
weren't there for very long. They were basically gone by the 70s.
Yeah, and exactly, both of them. Flemmi ended up going. He ended up having a heroin habit, which got the worst of him. He was not stable to begin with. When he was running around high, I guess he was just totally unpredictable. And Barboza was just as bad. Barboza, well, he didn't have a heroin habit. He was, from what I understand, addicted to uppers, and he was crazy to begin with. And when he was on uppers, forget about it. And it's funny because you hear numbers for Barboza, 28, 30, 30. But I could never figure it out. I've asked a lot of people, some who definitely should know, and while they say it's definitely at least 25, I can't figure out exactly how many Barboza killed. Same for Flemmi. But like you said, they made a name very quickly. They burned pretty bright and fast, and that was it.
Now, how close were Steve and Barboza?
Steve or Jimmy, his brother Jimmy, how close was Steve Flemmi and Barboza?
Yeah.
They actually, Barboza didn't really care for Stevie Flemmi that much. He loved his brother Jimmy Flemmi, would do anything with Jimmy. He didn't really care for Stevie. I could never figure that out. I've asked some people and they don't know why, but I can't put my finger on that, but they didn't get along, to be honest with you. Now, here's a little interesting fact about Stevie Flemmi. When the gang war started, for some reason, the Mclaughlin, the Wimpy Bennett gang that Stevie was with at the time out of Roxbury, they became associated with the Charlestown crew, the Mclaughlin gang. So they were, for the first few years, they were against the Somerville Winter Hill gang. Now, Stevie Flemmi put dynamite into Howie Winter's car one day, and Howie Winter was he was more, I guess you could say, he was having an affair with a woman, and he let her drive the car, and she started, and the bomb went off. It was not big at all. Something malfunctioned. They just popped the hood. But it's ironic that Stevie Flemmi put dynamite in Howie Winter's car, because years later, maybe I think 8 years later, they would combine for what was more or less the second generation of the Winter Hill gang. And they were, I spoke to Howie Winter and he loved Stevie Flemmi, loved him. And they would laugh at how Stevie put dynamite in his car one time and literally tried to kill him. So that's how, it's funny how allegiance would change, sometimes overnight. And it was deadly like that. Life was cheap, is how he would say.
Now, as we have to, what was Bulger doing during this time period?
Bulger was, I don't want to say he was lucky to be in prison, but he sat out the bulk of the first Irish gang war. He came home in 65. A lot of the violence happened before then, between 61 and 65. It did go on to 66, but Bulger sat out. It wasn't a South Boston issue. It was Somerville versus Charlestown and their friends. Now, Charlestown didn't have many friends. Everyone hated Charlestown. Funny, to this day, they still do. Charlestown kids are very different. Sorry if anyone's Charlestown, they're listening, but they're a different group, and they were more or less alone. But that doesn't mean that they weren't formidable. They were very, very tough. But so he sat out. He didn't. Yeah.
Had he been there, do you think he would have survived?
Do you know how much of that has been speculated? I don't think, a few things. I myself think he wouldn't have gotten involved. He was cunning. If it wasn't for him, he wasn't a crew type of guy. Like, he wouldn't do something for the crew. He would do something for him. So I believe he would survive, because he just wouldn't have gotten involved. He would have done anything. He probably would have played both sides.
The vibe I've always gotten from him is that he was never like a true or a full member of anything beyond himself. Even if he was on paper, he was always kind of he would be in a group but not really of it.
You
Manipulating it.
said it perfectly, absolutely perfectly. Yeah, that was Bulger, and that maybe that's what served him, why he was able to, besides riding on everyone, maybe that's what helped him get through a lot. But no, you're absolutely right. He had, I don't want to say he even had an allegiance to anybody. I still don't believe him and Stevie were the Winter Hill Gang in the 80s. And I don't believe, I think he would have killed Stevie or sold him out in a second. I don't think he cared for Stevie as much as everyone thinks. But one other thing I'd like to say is that if Buddy McLean was not killed in 65, the whole face of Boston would be very different. I don't think Bulger would have been much. He probably would have been there, but Buddy McLean was such, from what I've talked to guys who I've never heard a bad word about Buddy McLean. It's amazing what I've heard from so many people. If he had lived, things would have been very different as far as Winter Hill. Howie Winter wouldn't have taken over. Buddy would have gone. I don't believe Bulger. I think Bulger would have gotten killed had Buddy lived. So that helped. A lot of things helped Bulger. Again, sitting in prison and Buddy McLean getting killed. I really believe that.
So after who won the Second Irish Gang War, if anyone?
The Second Irish Gang War. Okay, the one I was just talking about, the first one. Winter Hill ended up winning the first one, but the second one, believe it or not, the Mullen Gang won. This is where things get fishy, because the Mullen Gang were very strong. When I said the Colleens had 12 to 15, the Mullens had 45 to 50, and they were young, they were violent, and that it really quick. Let me just go back to what started the Second Irish Gang War. What happened is there was a fight down at the Transit Cafe, and Kenny Colleen, Donnie Colleen's brother, literally bit the nose off of a guy named Mickey McGuire. He was a Mullen Gang member. He literally bit the nose. He took the tip of his nose, put it on ice, and sent it to Boston City Hospital because he knew that's where he was, and he actually had it stitched on, plastic surgery. But McGuire ended up living to the 90s. He owned a bar, and if you saw him, you could tell he had his nose bit off. So anyway, that's what started. The Mullen Gang was pissed that happened, and to the Colleens, the Mullens were just a bunch of kids, a bunch of babies. They weren't nobody to worry about, but they were. Once they started killing people, they were. And so this is what happened. The Mullen Gang was absolutely winning. They ended up killing Donnie Colleen at his house in Framingham. They gunned Bulger. They went for Bulger 3 times. They missed him. They were absolutely winning, and Bulger knew it. The Colleen Gang was folding. A lot of guys around him were the guy I was trying to remember before was Billy O'Sullivan. That was Billy O'Sullivan and Bulger were the main muscle for the Colleen. Billy O'Sullivan got killed. Bulger, he knew he was next, so he went to Howie Winter and said, "Listen, I know you run the dominant crew in the city. I need you to broker peace. I need help." And, the war was going on for so long. It was affecting a lot of people. The cops were coming down. You really couldn't do things. So everyone wanted peace. So peace was brokered. Johnny Monterano got involved. Howie Winter got involved. And what they did is they said, we're going to have a whole new order here. Things are going to be different. The Mullen Gang, you guys are going to come in. We're going to be one crew. And you guys can run South Boston, but the boss is going to be Bulger. Bulger will report to us, meaning Winter Hill. So at that time, you had 5 guys in Winter Hill, and Howie Winter, Jimmy Sims, Joe McDonald, John Monterano, and Stevie Fleming. And let me get to that. Flemmi was away at the time. He ended up coming home. He was on the lam in Canada. But so what they said is, I never understood this, why the Mullens agreed to it, because they were winning the game war. They could have said, no, we want we want to be our own boss, but they said okay, and they organized themselves. So instead of just having to rely on the B&Es and robbing trucks, now the Mullens were getting weekly paychecks from the gambling, from the loan shark. But I never understood why they agreed to that, because again, they were making more money and the killings stopped, but they weren't, Bulger was their boss. And there was still bad blood, and there was bad blood for many years, and people ended up dying because of that. Bulger would be mad at one of the Mullen Gang and go to Howie Winter and say he needs to be killed for this reason, and he would be killed.
And so Bulger was a regional manager.
Bingo. That's more or less
the way Angiulo was a regional manager for Patriarcha.
There you go. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay.
So he had South Boston, and under him he had the Mullen Gangs, and he sat. I don't want to say like it's a board of directors at the time. Winter Hill became what I like to call a confederation. They weren't. It wasn't like a hierarchy. There was 5 equals. The 5 guys I mentioned, they each had their own crew. They each had their own area. Howie had Somerville. Bulger had South Boston. Johnny had Roxbury in the South End. But they would come together for violence, for murder. They would come together for certain crimes. They started their own sports book. They ended up shaking down bookmakers. They were headquartered still out of Somerville, out of Winter Hill. There was a garage on Marshall Street in Somerville that they were headquartered out of. And every day they would all come to the garage, and they had a desk. They all had a desk, and they would get together every day. But like I said, they were more of a confederation than people always say, oh, Howie Winter was the boss. Well, he was, but he was also an equal to Johnny, to Bulger. They all pooled their money. Now, I mean, Howie, because he goes back further, he had more clout, more respect. The money was split up 5 ways.
Okay. And this begins what you call the second generation.
Exactly. Yeah, the first was just Buddy McLean as the leader and all the guys around him, Howie and Sal Sperlinga and guys like that. But then the second was the Confederation. And guys like Sal Sperlinga were still with Howie. Howie still had his Somerville crew. He still had his stuff. But again, they came together for violence and for certain things, certain rackets that they would split. And, you got to understand also at this time, Bulger's now currently an FBI informant. So even this time, he's still talking. And
Okay. It was my understanding that he did not become an informant until the mid-70s. I thought
71 is when he first got opened up. And here's the thing. He was first opened up, but they ended up closing him because I guess he wasn't given good information. I don't know what happened as far as the FBI. But where there's always been talk, and it's never been proven, is that he was also a state police and Boston police informant. Guys around South Boston would seem to just disappear if they cross Bulger. There's a handful of them. I gave you a bunch of them. They would just get a guy named Tommy Nee. He ended up going away. Freddie Weichel ended up going away. Guys that if you cross Bulger, you didn't really get killed. Sometimes you just got arrested and put away for a long time.
Yeah.
So to get back to what you were saying, you're right. He didn't become on paper. I forget. I think it was 75, but he was initially opened up in 71. Did give some information. I don't know specifically what, but he was talking a little. He definitely was.
No.
Now, but Stevie goes back to the 60s.
Yeah, I was going to say that the other point of debate is Flemmi's being an informant. When that began as early as 1965.
Yeah, that's exactly
underage
right.
Paul Rico.
Yep.
And they've always debated that. What role did he play in opening Bulger?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something I've never really been able to get an answer on. I've always wondered myself, did he point it out to him? Did he? That's a wonderful point. But there is one thing I want to say. Rico was Oh, Rico was a very, very corrupt agent. He going back to the 60s, even I think it was, now let me just say that you're right, he was 65 on paper, but even in 63, 64, Rico was giving information to Stevie Flemmi and to Frank Salemi, and they were part of the Wimpy Bennett crew. And I always wondered why Rico would give them information if he wasn't getting information. So I always wondered if Flemmi spoke before that and it just wasn't documented. I don't know. I can't say for sure. But I know for instance, one time he was supposed to be working. He went to the dog track, or excuse me, the horse track in Boston. His car got hit. He was driving an FBI car and he needed it to get fixed, and he brought it to Frank Salemi's auto body shop and got it fixed for free. So he would do like shady things like that all the time. One other thing you have to understand is that Rico also helped Winter Hill during the Charlestown Gang War, the first Irish Gang War. He set up a key guy for Buddy McLean. Are you familiar with this story at all? Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, that is 100% true. I didn't believe that myself, but I spoke to a few people who claim that is absolutely true. He set the guy up, and then he let Buddy stay in his basement for 3 days to sit out the heat. I mean, this is an FBI agent allowing Buddy McLean to sit in his basement for 3 days. That's amazing to me. Absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But so he's just a corrupt guy. But I mean, go back to your question. I don't know if Flemmi was the one who pointed it out. I don't know. That's a great question. That's one I'm not totally sure.
So when did the Bulger Flemmi partnership really begin? Because I find it hard to believe that they weren't at least aware of each other in the 60s.
Oh no, yeah, they were definitely aware of each other. In fact, Flemmi and Salemi made overtures of trying to take over South Boston in the late 60s. During the whole, they were going to try to use the Irish Gang War as a reason to come. There was a lot of chaos, so they said, "Oh, let's come in." You got to understand, Roxbury is very, very close to South Boston, so they were going to say, "Well, we just come in and do it." It didn't end up happening, but word got to Bulger. So I mean, they definitely knew about each other. I think they respected each other, but they didn't get buddy until the what I call like the Confederation years. The second Winter Hill Gang. And again, Flemmi, as I'm sure you know, was on the lam in Canada, so he was away. But when he came home, they seemed very, very close to each other. Now, something I just like to mention is they would not only do business together, they would hang out together, they would party together. And Bulger was very different. He didn't really party with them. Howie Winter's second wife, a woman by the name of Ellen, she hated Bulger, didn't trust him, said he was such a nasty guy. And that, that actually raised a lot of eyebrows, because here the whole crew was hanging out doing stuff together, and Bulger wouldn't come around. When he did, he was just more or less, he didn't get along with people. He was a real nasty guy. And even, I'm not saying they thought he was a rat or anything back then, but he stood out. He was different. They respected him. He was part of the crew, but he was a different guy even back then. Stevie would hang out. Johnny would definitely hang out. They would all hang out together and party, but Bulger wouldn't. And I don't know what that says. I just wanted to point out that he really wasn't liked.
It's interesting to note that neither Bulger nor Flemmi were especially large men.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Is it true that Whitey wore inlets in his shoes to make him look taller?
I asked that very question, and the answer is yes. Yeah. He had lifts. Yeah, that always blew my mind. But yeah,
do you see a touch of Napoleonic syndrome there?
Yes,
touch of
exactly.
compensation.
What do you say? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He was a very different guy. He for years, and I mean, this has nothing to do with anything, but there were always overtures about Bulger possibly being gay. He had a guy he worked with. First name was Hank. I can't recall his last name, but he was an openly gay guy. He had a bar in South Boston. He was a tough guy, and Bulger hung out with him back in the '60s when, you know, if you hung out with a gay guy, it really was looked at differently. And people did talk quite a bit about it. And I don't know if you've ever heard that Sal Mineo story where Sal came to South Boston to perform at Blindstrom's, which was a club in South Boston. And there was a rumor, apparently somebody walked in and found this guy Hank and Bulger with Sal Mineo in a compromising position. I could never confirm that, but
I may have heard that. Mainly, I just know the photo of him with the vest and the cowboy hat on, looking like a Village People member.
Yeah, exactly, the Village People one. Yeah, that always made me laugh.
Kevin Weeks has an explanation for that, but I don't know how much I believe Kevin Weeks.
Yeah, Kevin Weeks is a very. I don't. There's a lot I don't believe about Kevin Weeks. Kevin Weeks is not even allowed to step in South Boston, believe it or not. He can, about as far as he can get to South Boston is Quincy right about now. He's very hated in Southeastville. I don't believe that Kevin didn't know about the arrangement one bit. He claims he didn't, but I and many other people don't believe it. I just don't believe it. I'll never believe it.
I don't know if he's in a position to resent Bulger for it, given that it was probably that kept him off the streets as long as it did.
Yep. Kevin was a tough kid hand to hand, but he wasn't a killer. And you're absolutely right. That's that's what kept him alive and kept him in the money. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, all these people were going around, were either dropping dead or going away around them. And it's just kind of ironic that you guys didn't go. And this goes back to, I don't know if you know how the second Winter Hill Gang ended up becoming or breaking up. It was that horse racing thing. Have you ever heard about that? They had a horse.
Yes.
So the fact that Bulger and Flemmi sat out of that, that amazes me. The whole gang goes, but Bulger and Flemmi sit out, and nobody questions it. I mean, even Howie Winter didn't question it at the time. I mean, in retrospect, he did, but they thought, hey, good for them. They got away with it. They were able to move an agent to get away. I still can't get over that. The whole gang goes away, or didn't go away like Materano. He went on the lam because of it. But that's how they were able to set out. They were unindicted co-conspirators, which blows my mind.
Yeah, it seems almost a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? Unindicted co-conspirator.
That's exactly it. I've never understood that. Unindicted co-conspirator. I mean, you're in the mix, but you're unindicted. So, okay.
Yeah.
I never understood.
Yeah. So at the time during Winter Hill 2.0, how many members were there?
Okay, so there's a chart going around, or there was with them. And they break it down pretty good. The chart breaks it down pretty good. You had the 5 main guys. And then, as I said, each one of them had their own little crew, more or less. So, if you're looking for numbers, it's a lot more than that chart was, because the Somerville crew themselves behind Howie was very large. They were very large. Johnny Materano's crew was pretty big too. And so let me think about this real quick. I would say if you're talking actual members, not just associates, there are quite a bit of associates too. I would say you're talking about, I'd say 50 to 60. And I'm talking hardcore guys.
Okay. So it was on par with perhaps the DeCalventi crime family in New Jersey. Or mid-sized mafia family.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And with that, you got to understand, they covered a lot of ground. Johnny had Roxbury, which is a more or less an African-American neighborhood. So Johnny had quite a few really tough African-American guys with him. And I don't know if you ever heard that story about one time they had a show force because some guys from the Bonanno family was coming up. They owed money. I forget the exact actual reason, but they owed money. They were looking. I don't know how much exactly. It wasn't much, but anyway, the Bernardo family came up, and the Winter Hill Gang had a show force, and they called in everybody. I mean, everybody that was everybody showed up at the garage that day, and I guess the Bernados walked in, looked around, and more or less said, it's when we just forget about it, it's all good.
Mm-hmm.
I think they thought that this Irish crew was just your run-of-the-mill average, but these there was quite a few of them, and each one was his own man.
Yeah. Now, what about the more obscure figures from the time, like Nick Familia?
Yeah, Nicky Familia was part of Barbosa's crew,
mm-hmm.
and I should say, let me start over. In the '60s, he was part of Barbosa's crew, and he was definitely a tough guy and a killer. He was capable. He was a big guy, really tall, husky. He didn't get to be fat till later, but he was a big guy. When Barbosa ended up flipping, and essentially his whole crew was killed, almost all of them to a T were killed. Chico and Miko, they were all killed. Everyone was killed. Familia was still alive, and I'm sure, as you know, he ended up hooking up with Bulger later. He wasn't that liked in Somerville. Howie and them, they didn't like Nicky. I don't know why. I never got to figure that one out. But he did end up hooking up with Bulger and doing some. He really didn't have that big of a role in the later part. Yeah, he would maybe beat some guys up, whatever. But he ended up getting killed in an armed robbery, I think in '83. And
yeah. And then that there's also the controversy with the Black Friars massacre.
Yeah, I'm surprised you even know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In which he was a suspect.
He was a suspect, and it's funny because Howie Winter was I don't know the wire, but there was a wire, and he was quoted on the wire as saying, I would never kill one of my friends for whatever the money was. I forget it, whatever it was. But when I asked around, was he involved? From what I understand, he actually wasn't. He wasn't actually involved. There were a couple other guys. Their names are slipping my mind right now. I mean, I get that. I'm not saying that take it to the bank, but from what I've heard, he wasn't involved. But he definitely was a suspect.
So now I'm assuming you pinpoint the birth of Winter Hill 3.0 with the going away of Winter, etc. in '79.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when the headquarters for the first time left Somerville. Winter Hill, whatever you wanted to call them, they were always Somerville based, but now it was moved to almost right near Boston Garden in downtown Boston. I think it was Lancaster Street. It was another garage, but yeah, leaving Somerville was very, very. I mean, that said a lot. It pissed a lot of people off too.
And that was the garage where the notorious surveillance photos and footage was taken.
That's right, exactly. Yep. And they set up headquarters there. They were very close to the North End at the time. I mean, within walking distance to the North End. So yeah, they set up over there, and that said a lot. That things, there's a new regime in charge, or in town rather. There's a new boss, and that was a bold statement, and that was exactly when I would say 3.0 started.
Now, by 3.0, I know Bulger and Flemmi were the bosses. I know Weeks was probably involved by then, at least peripherally, because he usually marks the official beginning of his involvement with the Halloran murder.
Yeah. As far as murder, he was in. He started out as a bouncer at Triple O's.
Yeah.
Again, was the Transit Cafe, but his actual, real organized crime. You're right. The Halloran murder is where he got involved.
But how many holdovers were there remaining from the first two eras by then?
There was George Kaufman, who was a Jewish bookmaker and go-between guy. Have you ever heard of him? I'm not sure.
Yes, he owned the garage.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. Bingo. Yeah. So he went way back to the whole Buddy era. So he came with them, but that was a bit it, and this is where it gets confusing because the whole Howie crew was still around. Yeah, Howie went away, but his crew was still around. There were still guys in Somerville doing things, and a lot of them became, are they the Winter Hill Gang or is it Bulger? Or what do you call who? Who's what now?
Mm-hmm.
It became murky as far as the name, but everyone knew who was who.
And who was with who?
Yeah, exactly. But the Somerville, they started more fading into obscurity. Bulger definitely was planting flags everywhere. Started shaking down a lot of bookmakers, stepping on North End's toes. Danny and Julo, Gary's brother, had an issue with him. Danny was a very capable guy. He was the only killer out of the Angiulo family, believe it or not. So yeah, Bulger was definitely afraid of Danny and Julo. And there were guys in Watertown that they were trying to shake down. This guy Richie Brown, they were trying to shake down, and that was he was the North End guy, and Bulger had enough brass to go over there and demand money, and so yeah, he was planting flags everywhere.
So what was their main source of income at this point? Because it always seemed to me their business model was based on exploiting other criminals, victimizing other criminals.
At that time, you're 100% right, because you have to understand during the 2.0 era, they became bookies. Winter Hill themselves became bookies. And that was, I don't know if you've ever heard about that loan they had to take from Jerry and Julo for $250,000. They took it as a crew. And then when everyone went away, Jerry's like, where's my money? Who's paying the interest now? And that Bulger was like,
he got fucked over worse than anyone in the long run.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it was funny because Bulger was able to say there's no Winter Hill Gang.
That may be their greatest triumph, is making a mob boss pathetic.
He had to eat that money, and a lot of people, did he? No, he did eat that money. He did, yeah. So I mean, what I was trying to say about that is they gave it a shot to be bookies themselves, and they lost. They lost money. They did terrible as far as managing their own sports book. But that when Bulger said, "Screw it," like you said, we're just going to shake down everybody. And they started with the book. In Boston, there were a lot of Jewish bookmakers, quite a few. I mean,
that's a cultural stereotype almost. Yeah, and Jewish loan sharks.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, wherever you have a bookie, you have a loan shark. They go hand in hand. But there was Chico Krantz, Howie Levine. There were some really, really big guys in Boston, and they started going after them and literally just shaking them down. And then they started anybody doing anything. If you're robbing, you got to pay. If you're like some guys were dealing, Freddie Whitechell was dealing pot, you got to pay. Anybody doing anything wrong, you got to pay.
Now, I have to ask, because in most of the available literature on this era, the only ones that are ever written about, the only ones that you ever read about, are Bulger, Flemmi, and Weeks. It gives the impression that at that point the gang was just three guys. It was just down to a trio at that point. I'm assuming that wasn't really the case.
Now, see, because this is where it gets a little not confusing, but believe it or not, they were the Bulger and Flemmi were the guys. Weeks was under them doing some stuff. Yeah, there were some guys. I think his name is Jack Ford. He ran around. Some guys you never would hear about. But believe it or not, it really was just them running around grabbing and more or less using the name. They wouldn't say Winter Hill, but everyone knew the background. So they would assume they still had a whole crew behind them. And one thing you got to understand, Johnny Martirano was on the lam then. So Martirano, I think someone said he was like the mafia's boogeyman. He was the boogeyman to everybody. Everyone knew Martirano was still loyal to Bulger during those years. So that alone kept a lot of people in line. it spoke. I mean, Matarano was legendary. But that was the case until...
Even your dog agrees.
I don't... I was just going to ask you if you can hear that. Can you hear that? All right.
I can. It's fine.
All right. I apologize. Very excited. But that's how it went until Bulger decided to get into the cocaine business. And then things started happening when he got in the... I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the DEA lineup as far as who got arrested from the Bulger cocaine case, but there were something like 50 guys. So he had a network of guys then. But as far as the years until he got involved with coke, there was... Give me a second. Let me just go take care of the dog. Just 1 second. I apologize.
Oh, that's fine.
All right. I apologize about that. So yeah, up until then, they're really... I know it seems amazing, but there weren't that many guys. There was, some other guys, minor ones. I'd say maybe 5 you probably wouldn't have heard of. Many people wouldn't have heard of. And they aided them. But that was it until the drugs. And Bulger had money. He always had money, but the drugs is what brought him a lot of money.
So by that point, Winter Hill was just a code word for Bulger and whoever he happened to be with at any given time.
Bingo. Yep. That's it. And they were still called Winter Hill by the newspapers. Even the mafia called them the Hill. I don't know if people... Larry Zanino was caught on a wire threatening somebody who owed, as he called it, the Hill money. And he was saying, don't you know the Hill is with us? They're part of us. And saying, you can't screw these guys around. They're pretty... What he was talking about is Bulger and Flemmi. And Matarano in the background, in Florida. So, but yeah, you're right.
And then and then you have the IRA weapons shipments.
That's where that was Pat Nee's baby.
Yeah, because he was there when they murdered the one turncoat.
That's exactly. He actually drove him to his death. Yeah, Pat's the one who drove. I hate to say it. I believe that's known. I'm pretty sure that's known. If it isn't, I don't think there's anything to do with it. But yeah, Pat was definitely involved with that. He drove him to he picked him up at a bar called Ups and Downs, which is, I believe, is still actually around. It was until a few years ago. So he got him at John McIntyre was his name. He got him at Ups and Downs, and but yeah, we're having a party, and party was his death. And ironically, it was his brother's house, Pat Nee's brother's house. He was killed.
Tell me this, if you know, how much did Bulger actually give a shit about the Irish independence cause, about the provisional IRA? And
I can tell you, it's funny because I've asked this specifically. I've even talked to Pat Nee about this. He gave nothing, didn't give a shit, nothing. This was all Pat Nee. This was all. I shouldn't say there were some other guys with Pat, but this was, as I said, Pat was born in Ireland, came over here when I think he was 5. But Bulger didn't give a damn. And it goes back to what we said earlier. Bulger didn't give a damn about anybody or anything but him.
That, and there's a difference between an Irish person and an Irish American.
Yes.
Especially one who is...
Someone says they're Irish. You're absolutely right. Yep.
Second or third generation. I don't know which Bulger was or if he was even fully Irish. I know Kevin Weeks isn't.
That's a one I don't know. I think if anything he would be second, but I don't know if he's even full. I don't recall. I know where he grew up in the pride, but I don't. That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. But it's funny because I know is that back in the 70s and even the 80s, at every bar in Southie, Somerville, Charlestown, there was always a jar marked IRA and stuffed, and everyone would be just giving money, and that it kind of became a running joke because it was you just put Bulger, on the jar. But I don't believe he cared one bit. Whereas, I'm sure as you know, Pat definitely did.
Yeah. And then there's the O'Halloran murder, but that's been discussed to death.
Yeah. Now, one thing about Halloran, I don't know if you know this, but he actually does go back. He didn't come on the scene with Bulger. He came on the scene with Howie. Howie was his guy back in the '60s, and Halloran was a very tough guy, psychotic as well. But yeah, he was originally Howie's guy. And then when Howie and they went away, he just more or less didn't have anybody really, and kind of came under Bulger, and we all know what happened there.
Yeah. Do you know of any connection to, say, what the Westies were doing in Manhattan at the time? That was over an hour away.
Yeah,
it was away.
I've never. This is one thing I've never been able to figure out for sure. I know there was a guy named Harold Farmer Page. I forget him. I know that Winter Hill, Howie, and they were tied to him, but I don't know of any Westies connection. And I always thought that was
I've never found one either.
Yeah, and they're only 4.5 hours away, 5 hours. You would think there would have been something, but I to the best of my knowledge, there isn't. It doesn't mean there wasn't, but I don't know about that.
It's interesting in his autobiography. Weeks always refers to Winter Hill. Well, he only refers to them once. He refers to them as they, never as we.
Is that right? I never even realized that.
And he casts them as another group that they, meaning he and his Bulger and Flemmi, were not actually part of.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, that's shocking to me. I'll be honest with you. That's actually bizarre.
But then again, yeah, he missed out on the prehistory. He was like young enough to be their son.
Oh, absolutely. He was in high school
during the busing. That.
So, yeah, you're absolutely right. He came on the scene, and I don't think he even knew any of the guys, any of the even Johnny or any of them. Yeah, I don't. To the best of my knowledge, you're right. He sat out a lot. He's a very young guy at the time. So
there's no reference to any of them in his autobiography.
Well, and I think the reason for that is Johnny, Pat Nee, Jimmy Materano, they're still around. They still are in Suffolk. They get together at a restaurant. They did before COVID at this one restaurant every Sunday. He didn't want to. I did notice when I remember about Weeks' book, he didn't name a lot of people, and a lot of those people are still around. He did seem to name drop some others, but he did leave a lot out, I noticed. And even the whole Halloran thing, I forget how because Nee was definitely the guy in the back seat, and he said there was a guy in the back with a ski mask, but Nee never wore a ski mask. He was the guy in the back seat. So I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. I don't know if he mentioned Nee in the book as far as the Halloran hit.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read it, but Nee does not show up much at all.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Nee can still hold his head and high and salty. Materano, they're all Weeks really cannot come into the salty. That's not a joke. He's not welcome one bit, not one bit.
Though he does reference another Kevin frequently, one who also has an Irish surname.
Mcdonald, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. He was a tough kid. He was part of the drug crew. I think they call him Andre the Giant was his nickname. But yeah, I noticed that he does name drop the drug guys quite a bit. I don't know if it's because they were all over the paper, so their names are already known, or if because those are the years he was key. He was pretty much side by side with Bulger.
So moving, I'm just going to skip over the Deborah Hussey incident.
Sure.
There's no reason to dwell on that. Moving forward into the late 80s, it seemed things were dying down by then.
Yeah. A lot of it, the drugs. I don't know if he knew, but the drugs weren't going to last forever. I think he knew that the DEA had a case that was definitely becoming a liability. The Jewish bookmakers, they were getting old. Some of them were retiring, and that was a big thing that, from what I understand, upset him quite a bit. He would charge them like a retirement fee, just stupid shit. Yeah, he would charge them so
That
much
is
money.
very petty.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he made
That's pettier than something the federal government would demand.
Yeah, yeah.
It's right up there with marriage tax.
One thing I just want to mention, I don't know if it matters at all, but the difference, there was always spoken about the difference between what Bulger did and what others did. So Bulger would charge for everything. He would charge a monthly fee. He would also charge a fee if he had to sit down for you. If you had a beef, if you were a bookmaker and you had a beef with someone else, he would charge you to sit down, and then he would charge you a retirement fee. Whereas others, I'd say the Andrulas, whatever, if they had to work it out, if they had a beef they had to settle for you, that was part of why you paid them. It wasn't, Bulger, you paid to live. The others you paid, it was a working relationship. It just shows how petty he was, he was a different guy.
And so by the early 90s, what's going on by the early 90s? The only thing of note I could find from that period, that is, prior to his indictment, was a winning lottery ticket.
Yeah. And I'm sure you figured out he didn't actually win. What happened?
Actually, I didn't figure that out.
Yeah. Guy in his crew, I think his last name was Lindsay. His brother hit the lottery, and Bulger heard about it and offered to buy the ticket from him. Now, I don't know how he could buy it. I think it was $10 million. I don't know how he bought a $10 million ticket. I don't know the specifics. Like I said, my thing was I never really had an in as far as the South Boston cruise, but I was able to ask some questions. And what I understand is the ticket became his, Weeks, Lindsay, and the guy's brother. So I think it was split 4 ways. And Bulger now was able to show, the Fed's income. He was able to actually prove, to show. So from what I understand, he bought it from the guy, but I understand he didn't get anywhere near the true value of it. And I'm sure to this day he regrets mentioning to his brother that he hit the lottery, because that became, like I said, Bulger's. Again, he just came in and took it. Much like he came in and took the liquor store from, Stippo Rakes. He would just come in and take things. And
yeah. About the liquor store, I know Kevin Weeks kind of whitewashes the story in his biography.
Yeah.
I don't really, obviously I wasn't there, so I don't know who to believe.
How did did Kevin? Because the way I always heard the story different from, I thought, the popular opinion. How did Kevin spin it? Did
Stippo was a inept businessman and inept proprietor, that his business was failing and he had to get rid of it, and Bulger essentially agreed to take it off his hands.
Oh, okay. So he sweat.
And
Robin
there was a dispute over the exact terms. That's
I heard
spins it. There's no infant daughter teething on his gun or anything like that.
Yeah. I always heard that was bullshit. That I heard that did not happen as far as the whole teething on the gun. What I understand happened, and again, I can't say this is the true, but I heard it from 2 different people, is that Stippo actually did agree to sell it, and then he changed the amount. And Bulger said, no, we're sticking to the original deal. Here's the cash that we agreed on. And so he did muscle him, but he muscled him to keep his word, I believe. Stippo, he's dead. But I can tell you right now, Stippo was a piece of trash. His His family, they're notorious. His family, his sister was a drug dealer for Bulger. She was, I believe, the only woman that went away in the drug case. Stippo, don't believe it. He's not a good guy. He's definitely a shady. He's not a criminal like they were, like organized crime. But if he could cut corners, he would. And
he was not an innocent victim, is what you're saying.
That's exactly it. Absolutely. He went to him.
He does convincingly portray himself as one in the documentary.
Yeah. When I see him in what's her name? Is it what's her name? That one of the girls' brother, I forget the kid. They were best friends in later in life, and they both, you're absolutely right. He portrays himself a victim very well. But no, I from what I understand, he had changed his mind, and Bulger did force him to stick to the original agreement.
So, by the early 90s, what was left? I'm aware there's a character named Red Shea, a younger man at the time, was working under him.
Absolutely, yeah.
Or that he was extorting.
Well, you can't really. Yes and no. Red was a very tough. He still is. He's out and running around Southie and doing legal things, not running around doing anything bad. He's a very tough kid. You don't want to ever cross him. He's a legit kid. He is a very tough kid. Things I heard of stories of him from prison, amazing. But anyway, he was very young. I think he was in his early 20s, 23, 24, and he was more or less a lieutenant in the Bulger drug organization. So he bought his coke from Bulger. Bulger didn't extort him. Bulger was actually afraid of Red. I've heard that quite a bit. Red would have killed him in a second if he could have ever gotten away without, having Stevie to deal with or Materano. So okay, I mean, Bulger made money off of him, but he never really extorted Red. There was, I always heard this story, and I do believe I recall from Week's book where there was an incident where he pulled a gun on him, and I forget. I don't know. I don't see that happening. I could never see Red being okay with that. I believe Kevin Weeks was there. I could never see him allowing Weeks to pull, even if Weeks was Bulger's surrogate son. Red would never, from what I understand, allow that. So yeah, I mean, he was under Bulger. He made money with Bulger. I should say Bulger made money off of him. But I don't believe he was like an extorted victim, more or less. But he was one of the many that went away in 90, August of 90.
And it should be clarified that the Bulger drug operation, as you're calling them, was not Winter Hill. That was something new and different.
That's exactly right. That's correct. Winter Hill, when I say Winter, the 1.0, 2.0, how you're saying, which is perfectly, they never were involved in drugs. I mean, back 60s and 70s, sure, there were drugs, but it wasn't enough like it was in the 80s, where I don't want to say it was lucrative. I'm sure maybe it was, but they never got involved. But Bulger did, and that people still called it the Winter Hill Gang, but it really wasn't. It was, I think, even the police at the time called it the Bulger Organization. I think that's the best way to name it, the organization. They, the South Boston crew at that time, were doing their own thing. And sure, Johnny Materano was still getting money from Bulger, weekly or monthly, actually, but he wasn't part of it. Johnny actually had his own thing going. Johnny had a guy named, Jesus, what the hell is his name? I can't, his name's slipping me right now, but Johnny had him up here. So Johnny was in Florida in the Lamb till 95, 79 to 95, and he had this kid up here, more or less loan sharking his money out and running a gambling ring. He ran a very large one in the 80s and 90s, and so Materano made money from Bulger. Bulger would throw him cash, not much, not a lot, from what I understand, but Materano made his own money, still doing stuff, and nobody touched him. Nobody tried to shake him down, or the guy who was putting his money out in the street. They just let him do his own thing. But yeah, so the Winter Hill was not part of that whole drug thing. That was something different. And that whole drug thing didn't last all that long. I think maybe 85. I'd like to say 86 to 90. It shut down in 90.
Yeah. And then what were they doing after that? What were they doing in the early 90s around the time of the lotto ticket? Were they just in stasis?
The only thing I know for sure, there were still some major Jewish bookmakers out there. Chico Krantz was still going. So there were still some guys paying him. But every year came, I remember 93 hit, and even Chico was starting to call it quits, and things were folding. And that's when Bulger just started taking trips. He just started traveling. I almost like to look at him as semi-retired at that time. Flemmi always had his club called the Marconi Club over in Roxbury. He still had his own little things going on, but even he was doing things. I'm sure you always heard he was a paratrooper back in the 50s, and he would continue to go skydiving around the world and go to different meets with the veteran friends, and so they were more or less living life. But you gotta, again, how, and I'm sure this happened, I never got to ask many people, but how did they set out the drug case when they were the guys? They were the main. Yet again, they sat it out in 79, they sat it out in 90. See the writing on the wall? Like, what the hell? These guys are always dodging and setting out things that they were either part of or led. And a lot of the guys who went away in 90, they were known as the D Street crew. D Street was in South Boston. I can say their name, the Hogan family. They're very well known, but it's all. I'm not saying anything that isn't known. The Hogans were very well known. The 70s in South Boston, they were part of Bulger's crew. 80s, they became part of the drug organization, and then they all went away. And then they all came home. And that, they came home, I forget the years, but I remember they owned a store on D Street. I remember going over there, and it was just a little convenience store. But boy, you would have thought it was Fort Knox. I mean, there was cameras everywhere. I don't know what else was going on. This is about 10, 12 years ago, and that's when they first got out and started coming back on the scene. And some of the D Street crew is still around to this day. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know anything about that, but they're the only remnants that I know that are still around, other than Pat Nee. Pat's around. He's got a kid named Charlie with him they're running around doing stuff, but nothing illegal as far as I know. But he's still around, and yeah, I mean, it's funny because there's still remnants, but it's nothing. And I believe it all fell apart like around 93, 94. That's when things just, a lot of things changed in Boston. The numbers became the mass lottery. They opened up a casino out in Connecticut. Now they have one in Boston, or right out of Boston. But a lot of things that they made money off of became legal. So they lost their rackets. And even now, marijuana is legal. You can go a mile away from me, you can go get it. Whereas before, that was big business in South Boston, in Somerville. Hell, I remember in the 90s, even kids I knew, it was big business. Yeah. But now it's all gone.
It's interesting to talk to you because I think for most people, the main source of information on this subject is Howie Carr.
Yeah.
And he's problematic in that he's a bit of a carnival barker, sensationalist.
Yes.
One step above writing for the Weekly World News or something like that.
Yeah.
And a lot of what he says, I take with a grain of salt, just as I took Week's autobiography with a grain of salt.
Yeah, that's safe to do.
This claim that I've heard about Bulger being a pederast and a sexual predator, I've only heard that from him. He only mentions it in passing. He cites no sources for it.
No, that I do know for a fact is true. Yeah. I know one kid that I absolutely believe. I mean, I know him personally, and Bulger didn't molest him, and Bulger ended up buying his parents furniture for their house. He filled it up. He bought it. You got a whole living room furniture. This was in the late 70s, and he's the only one I know for a fact. I do believe him. I do. This kid is not the type that's going to, that's not. You don't really want to say that, or it's just something you wouldn't claim. And
if a journalist like Carr were to claim it, you could dismiss it because that's exactly the kind of rumor that would float about a controversial public figure.
Yep. Yeah. It's not like Bulger, not Bulger, excuse me. Carr used to claim Bulger would hang around gay bars. That I never heard. That's not true. He would always defame Bulger anyway. He hated Bulger. Any way he could. So I mean, he would come at him with any try. And I always wondered if where the hell he got his info on that, as far as the molestation things, because I had heard that for a while. I forget how many years ago, but that's something I did. A lot of people knew about.
Well, Flemmi is on record as having violated his stepdaughters.
Yes.
Growing up. So his claim that in 1983, Bulger had a 16-year-old girlfriend that he took with him to Mexico. Well, maybe, but Flemmi's a tainted source.
Exactly.
The claim from Carr was that he and Flemmi would lurk at like a Catholic recreational center, youth recreational center. And, one of those places services for like street kids after school.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I have a hard time believing that.
Yeah.
Logistically.
That I'm with you.
Because if places like that are secure, they're closely watched by the employees. If two middle-aged men, both locally known criminals, had entered and were kind of lurking, they'd be noticed.
Oh, absolutely.
They'd be thrown out.
These guys are legendary. Everyone knew them. So you're right. These not only are just two middle-aged guys, these are notorious guys. Everyone knows them in the Boston area. So you're absolutely right. Those places are supervised. They're staffed pretty well, for my understanding. You're absolutely right.
Like the Boys and Girls Club type places for street kids. Those aren't. You've got to be a fucking ninja if you're going to try to pull that kind of shit in a place like that, which I doubt those guys were.
Exactly. That I can't see. I mean, and what's it look like to the guys around them? Oh, where's Stevie and Whitey? Oh, they're at this place, right? I mean, I don't see that one bit. I can't see that. I can't. I mean, I don't know what Bulger's sexuality is, but all right, if I'm going to believe that he did touch that kid, then what's that say about him? Were girls on his arm just to, I'm not saying pedophilia in equals gay, but I don't know. Were girls just a trophy on his arm? I don't know.
It's odd because he was always, to my knowledge, in a relationship with an adult woman.
That's right. Exactly.
He even had a son of his own.
Quite a bit. Some of the girls he had in the some of the guys were saying, some of these girls were beautiful. So yeah, he always was around. And you got to remember, in the Air Force, he was, I don't know if he was convicted, but he did rape a girl out in Montana, I think it was, when he was in the Air Force.
I thought they dismissed the charge.
Yeah, they did. But what I'm saying is, from what I understand, it actually happened. It did.
Okay.
That actually did happen. He did actually violate the girl. So I mean, I don't know if it's. It
could have been that he was just a predatory person in general. That's
exactly what I'm getting at. Just right. Yeah.
And that bent that he had that manifest in different forms as a criminal, as a sexual predator, etc.
Yep.
It could have been that he had no real set sexual orientation, that he was just kind of impulse driven.
Yep. That I absolutely buy. Yes.
depending on how old this boy was at the time.
From honestly, when I know he was 8.
Oh my God, that
Yeah.
is obscene.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it was.
See, to me, that bespeaks like just a what's the word for it? Just, yeah, like I said, just an impulse-driven predator.
Right, right. I mean, that's a whole other level type shit. I mean, that's just like what?
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't even fathom that. It blows my mind.
Oh.
It does. But yeah, you're right. I do believe the whole predator. Yeah, I definitely buy that. Definitely.
But and Flemmi seems just as bad.
Yeah, I was gonna say if he's not equal, he's just a step below. Because I mean, how does a girl sit on your lap at age 3 or 4? He came into that girl's life when she was, I believe, 3 or 4. How does she? I had a stepdaughter. How do you look at that girl? I mean, the stepdaughter's 21 now. How do you ever go there? I can't even. I can't even get that. And he started with her in her teens. I think she was 13 when it started. I don't know for sure, but you're right. He's a monster of his own.
Yeah. They together they make Weeks look good by comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. Weeks was married, had kids. Yeah, and he looks beaver, leave it a beaver type stuff next to them. So
Yeah. Even Martariano.
Yeah,
strikes me as, I don't want to say an innocent, but as just a regular guy who happened to fall into that life.
Right. He had he had a couple different women. Yeah, he had a wife, but he had a couple of women on the side. But he was a family guy. He raised kids. Bulger, I believe, was one of his kids' godfathers.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew of the kids, and even Flemmi. Flemmi had sons. For the most part, he did raise them, and his kid did get into the rackets he tried to.
Yeah.
But that didn't amount to much. But there was always just something odd with Stevie and Whitey. And let me just say, no one ever called him Whitey. Everyone always called him Jimmy. I don't know anybody that called him Whitey. But Stevie and Jimmy, there's something just different with them. Very different.
They're not your run-of-the-mill mobsters.
Right.
They're kind of on another level.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And you add that to their no loyalty to anybody, because if you ever look at Stevie's papers, he didn't turn in his brother, but his own friends, he allegedly told on Frank Salemi, his partner for years. He's allegedly the one who got him arrested by Conley. Conley just happened to run into Salemi in New York City. I don't buy that one bit. Him and Flemmi split, and he ends up getting arrested by the local South Boston guy.
I have to say, in the whole saga, Connolly comes off the worst.
Absolutely.
Because
that's another piece of trash.
Criminals are what they are. They do what they do. That's to be expected. But if you're in law enforcement, if your job, your paycheck is to stop crime,
yep,
you really should not be investing in crime for your own benefit.
That's exactly it. And like you said, if you're one thing, okay, you're that. You're a criminal, fine. I'm not going to say you're great, but that's you. Okay, fine, fair enough. But like you said, you get involved in law enforcement at a federal level, and I mean, you want to talk corrupt. There are things that, from what I've heard, that they haven't even scraped the surface as far as Conley. I mean, this guy. Someone even said he was literally part of the crew, the gang. I believe it. He definitely. I mean, I remember one guy was telling me, this lawyer who knew him was saying how he would literally, and this is in the 80s, he's running around, $1,500 suits, just looking like he's not a FBI special agent here. I guess he had uncashed checks in his desk and always dealt with cash, and guys would see him out at some of the bars around Boston. He carried himself like a wise guy. He actually thought he was one of them. And
well, in a sense, he was by that point.
Exactly. He was part of the crew. He made some big money. And I remember, I don't know where if I heard or read it, but he got a boat. He wanted to get a boat, and Bulger was furious over that. And showing money he shouldn't have, and yeah, it's a mess because this whole time you gotta understand that the Angelos went away or went down. The indictment came in thinking 84, they went away in 86. That was a huge hit to the Italians. So who do you go to next? The biggest crew right now is Bulger and them, and that he would still say, "Oh no, the mafia is still huge. We got to go after them." And Winter Hill or whatever you want to call them at that time, they were whoever got arrested the next day they'd sweep in. I remember I heard this story that in '84 they went away. The Angelos went away. This guy Paulie Antiso, he ended up going away, and the next day, literally, Stevie Fleming is in the North End trying to take over Paulie Antiso's sports gambling business and numbers business. So these guys would come in and just use, the FBI would go after them. They would come in and get the crumbs, whatever was left. Yeah. And I don't believe it lasted long, but he came in for a bit and made money off of it. So if they didn't kill you on the streets, they'd get their guy to go after you, and put you away.
Mm-hmm. So moving forth, by 1994, after the indictment, after Bulger's on the lam, after Flemmi is incarcerated, all that really remains is Weeks, it seems.
Yeah, and Weeks, I'm sure you could figure this out, had a problem. He lived, off of Bulger, the reputation. And at this time, Weeks had a serious issue with some people in Charlestown. They were coming by and if Weeks didn't get arrested, he would have been probably killed by these guys. These are serious guys. And they were trying to, I don't know what was left. I really don't. What was left out there at this time. But whatever it was, they were trying to come in and take over. And it was getting bad. And then Weeks ends up getting arrested, and I think that more or less saved his life. And
according to the literature, like generic sources, the Winter Hill Gang continued to exist until 1999 with Weeks as the boss, inheriting the position from Bulger. But
never.
It doesn't seem there really was a Winter Hill Gang by that point. Well, if he was in charge of something, what? Because according to his autobiography, all he was really doing at the time was managing the variety store.
Right.
Working the counter. And so that seemed to contradict even his own narrative.
Right, exactly. Right. And that's, it's funny because when they say that, I say, well, what do you mean by Winter Hill? Are you talking about the Somerville crew? There was still, Joe Mcdonald was out there in the 90s. Remember Joe, who was from 2.0? Him and his brother Leo were out there in the 90s in Somerville. They were making moves. They were doing things. So are you talking about that? Or do you mean the South Boston? It gets blurry. Who do they, when they're talking Winter Hill, what are they talking about? There was always still a Somerville crew, but they weren't anywhere as big as far as, they weren't into drugs, so the money wasn't big. But
it seems it would be best to think of it less as an organization, more of as a community.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, I like that. Yep. But as far as Weeks being boss, that actually makes me laugh. That's funny. No, that's definitely not the case. No, that's funny.
Now, like during the transitional periods, like how long did it take to go from, say Winter Hill 2.0 to the Bulger Drug Organization? Because it seemed that happened. Winter Hill 2.0 peaked in the early 80s and then just pretty fast.
Yeah, I would say prior to them getting involved in drugs, when the Angelos went on in 84, they were able to get a lot of the bookies. They were able to take over some of the casinos that they had, casino nights and gambling places. And because Boston is one thing, but you can understand, like Winter Hill, going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, there's always other communities around Boston, Lowell, Lawrence, that had pretty large areas. Sometimes they had a large Greek population, and they had like a dice game out there. I forget the name, but Bulger ended up Howie had that for a bit in Lowell, and then Bulger ended up taking it. So they always had a lot of things going on, but I think they peaked around 83, 84, and then once the drugs, that's when they hit the big money, the drugs. I mean, they had a lot of money in the drugs, a real lot. I mean, they had they had a lot of, I forget how many keys coming in at one time, but they were bringing in a lot of money from that. So,
And
I mean, go ahead.
it's my understanding that Bulger never actually owned a home, or his address was always deliberately evasive. Like he was still living with his mother into his 40s.
That's what I'm just going to say. He lived with his mother in the projects very late in life. When, he's a guy who could afford quite a bit, and he would be, I guess, resting his head there. Now he bought a woman a house. He was in a relationship with this woman for a long time in the 60s and 70s. He got her a house. He would have dinner with her and then go out and do his stuff in the night and come home whatever time and rest at his mother's house. But you're right. He never really had his own place. When he got with that other woman, Catherine Gregg, they did, she had a place, I think it was in Quincy. And, he would spend some time there. But that's the one thing I always wondered with Bulger. Like, from what I understand, there was quite a few money, especially at the drug years, but he didn't show it all that much. I don't know. I really don't know what, how we went to our own properties. I know, I know where a lot of his money went, and guys like Monterano, the same. I don't know what Bulger did, and especially when he was able to prove tax purposes, he had a allegedly, legit income. He still didn't go out and buy anything.
Makes you wonder why he bothered making it in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at. What were you doing? Is it ego driven, or is it, I don't know. Yeah. What are you doing? And I think he could have called it quits after that 90 roundup of the drugs and never done anything again, and he'd have been absolutely fine. And I just don't get it. I don't get it.
Yeah. I think, I always thought the outrage over his and Flemmi's being informants was just so naive. I don't know if that's the best term, but it's like
let's put it perfectly.
It's like two things. A, the only reason one involves himself with this in the first place is out of self-interest.
Right.
B, this entire existence is based on predation, on fucking over others, on exploiting others for your own gain. Becoming an informant, becoming a rat, is really just the next logical step.
Yep, exactly.
They'd be naive to think otherwise. It's almost as if they assume there's some kind of code.
Right. That old code that people swear is there, and it's not.
That exists as anything other than a formality.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, not only that, you're absolutely right about that, but anybody that knew even a little of their past, they sat out the 79 indictment, they sat out the 90 indictment, and then you hear their informants and you're shocked? No. I mean, no. I mean, there were quite a few people who said that for a long time, well, I shouldn't say said that, but asked, they speculated. How are these guys the only ones still out here? How are they always dodging? It's amazing. It's amazing.
I don't know. It makes you wonder about criminal intelligence.
Yeah.
Obviously, it takes a certain type of intelligence to function in that career.
Right.
To be able to plan crimes, cover them up, to be able to manage finances, this and that. You can't leave any loose ends. But at the same time, there seems to be a lack of common sense and a lack of self-awareness there.
I agree 100%. And I'm going to say this is one thing that always surprised me is that, I don't know if you can tell, I think rather highly of Howie Winter. I thought rather highly of him. he wasn't surprised about Bulger, but he was shocked about Stevie. It broke his heart that Stevie was an informant. And I could never understand how you didn't see it coming. It wasn't even, just for me, again, I keep saying this, the 79 unindicted co-conspirators, it says it all to me. That's all I'd have to hear or see. And that's it. You take out his other stuff in the past, how he was able to get away with some of the 60s murders and how come he was buddy with H. Paul Rico? Do you not question that? It just blows my mind. But Howie Winter was shocked about Stevie, but not too surprised about Bulger, from what I understand.
Well, what else interests me is to just look at it from a psychological perspective. What makes men like this? What makes this kind of man? Is it genetic? Is it environment?
Yeah.
Is it some combination?
Exactly. Environment, genetic. That's yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because we know in the case of Flemmi, he was a criminal. His brother was a criminal. His other brother was a police officer, but a corrupt one that enabled criminals.
Oh, I didn't think you even knew that. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So what we have is a bad seed. Family-wide bad seed.
That's perfect. I agree. Yeah.
I know less about Bulger's family. I know Billy is who he is.
Yeah, but Billy is as corrupt in his own little way. But Billy, sure, he was a legitimate, state president or state senate president or whatever. But he was a legal criminal. That I've heard a lot about him too. I mean, nothing like that. He was actually breaking actual crimes, but he's another one. Let's just say, he's had a lot of the similar traits. He wasn't vicious like Bulger, but he was cunning, But as far as the rest of his family, he had a brother, Jackie. I don't know too much about him. He had a couple of sisters. Bulger seems a little different. I don't know if he was the one in his family who just something he was born. I always think about this. I always wondered about this. How many guys in organized crime, I would call them mobsters, how many are mentally ill? And what I mean by mentally ill can be, if it could be actually diagnosed of having some personality disorder or whatever. I believe Bulger was absolutely had a personality disorder. I think Flemmi did. And you just got to wonder, are they born that way? Is it a combination of that and their environment?
There are different disorders. Which do you suspect them of having?
It's a great question. From Bulger, I can't say I would know myself, but I definitely some sort of personality disorder. But like I said, he always had a problem actually getting along with people. When at the end of the night, when
the terms sociopath and psychopath are used way too often, way too loosely.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at Reddit, it's thrown around. You look at everywhere, it's thrown around. I think Bulger's definitely a sociopath. I mean, so isn't Flemmi. I mean, it's, yeah. I mean, I think they could be tagged with multiple issues, but I definitely think
in Bulger's case, I know towards the end of his life he credited his last girlfriend, I can't think of her name,
Catherine Gregg.
Yeah, for making him feel, and I quote, more human.
Oh, wow.
Compared to how he had in the past, which I interpret to mean a lack of empathy, a lack of emotional connection to others, a lack of enjoyment in normal activities, which...
That's interesting he said that. Because you got to understand, when he said that, he's still out there in California doing taking advantage of a homeless guy so he could get his ID. He's still doing things in his late age. He wasn't committing crimes and extorting people, but he wasn't. I mean, if that's the case, if that's how he made her feel, or rather, that's how she made him feel. I mean, he's still, to his core, I think he's still rotten, more or less.
Yeah, he did seem to be bothered when his son died, as anyone would be.
Yeah, that's something that always. You're right about that, and I don't know if I'm giving him too much credit for that, because I actually was surprised at that. But you're right. I mean, who wouldn't be upset about that? I remember hearing how they were shocked. They didn't even know he had a kid, and to find out he came in and said, my son died, and I don't want it. Don't worry about blah blah blah. They were shocked. They had no idea that he even had a kid. But I think that always surprised me that he took it bad. I don't know what I expected, but that did surprise me.
Yeah. As for Flemmi, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because very little is actually known of his personal life besides his molesting his stepdaughters.
Yeah. I mean, other than that, and other than the fact he could kill a girl in his life, what was her name? I forget her name. It was his girlfriend of many years that he allegedly loved, and he ended up killing her, or having her killed as well. I mean, he's a guy who could inform on his friends, molest his stepdaughter, then have her killed, and then kill this girl who was in his life from, I think she was 19 when she met him. And I mean, this guy, that says a lot. That says quite a bit right there.
Now, within the Latter-day hierarchy, where do you think Kevin Weeks really stood?
I think Kevin Weeks I think he was a glorified assistant. Maybe if you want to call him like a
Aaron boy?
I want to call Bulger assistant to the manager. I don't believe, in the beginning he was there, he was tough with his fists, but Kevin ended up, he got a little chunky. Kevin wasn't throwing fists by the mid to late 80s. And, he was there, I think, just to maybe add a little muscle, because as we talked about, it was him, it was Stevie, it was Johnny down in Florida, but he needed to show some younger bodies, and he definitely was a younger body, and proved himself with his fists. But I don't believe Kevin was really all that. I don't. Without Bulger, he wouldn't have been any. You understand? Kevin also held a job with the T during the day. So I mean, I understand it. In the beginning, it wasn't a no-show job, so he actually had to show up and do something. I don't know what he did. Eventually became a no-show job. But Kevin, he wasn't just this arch criminal raking in the money. He would go out, work the T in the day, go out with Bulger at night, blah blah blah. And I don't see him being all that, to be honest with you. That's why I laugh at him being the joke, boss rather, running the crew to 99. And no, I just not at all.
But whatever he was, his position in history has been secured.
Absolutely, and let's be honest, it did. It was lucrative for him. I mean, he certainly made some money. It's absolutely. So I mean, it. With that said, he just wasn't your average guy. But yeah, I mean, like you said, his history is now secure. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't see him as a practical necessity, if only to appearances. Because let's face it, by the late '80s, how intimidating were Bulger and Flemmi really physically?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And times are changing. There wasn't your white middle class or white lower class criminals anymore. A lot of the Spanish, a lot of African American gangs were coming around then. Heroin was becoming big, which Bulger would never touch, wouldn't allow into South Boston. They did coke till the cows come home, but they didn't touch heroin. And heroin was getting big. So times are changing. And even right now, if you look at South Boston is still heroin, a lot of Dominican crews, ties to cartels. It's a whole different story. So I mean, you're absolutely right. How intimidating would they be?
Well, I just mean in terms of their appearance,
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. I mean, what was he? I'm trying to figure his age back in '91.
As a little guy in his early 60s, all that.
Yeah.
Much to be afraid of.
No, that I agree 100%.
Now, as our conversation winds down, as the episode winds down, I'd like to discuss the what ifs. For instance, what if McLean hadn't been murdered? What if he had continued as the boss?
Yeah, that I I find myself daydreaming, wondering many times because the whole face of organized crime, I believe, would have changed. Buddy, I mean, I can't stress it again. Buddy was a charismatic guy, a loved guy, a tough guy with his fist, and a killer. And he was absolutely loved. People would have just laid it on the line for him, and he was a good leader that way. And had he lived, he made it to the very end of the war. The Mclaughlins were killed, and the Hughes brothers ended up, Stevie and Connie Hughes ended up killing Buddy. They were the last remaining Mclaughlin guys out there, more or less. There were some leftovers, but so he made it right to the end. It's like he made it to the end of the race and tripped right before the finish line. And he had he lived, I think everything would have still been centered in Somerville out of Winter Hill. And I think that I just think things would have been so different. And had Bulger barked or done anything, tried to get bigger than just South Boston, I don't see him. I think they would have killed him. I don't see it happening. I think eventually Somerville, Howie and all them were bound to take over Southie, whether it be because of the gang war, the second Irish gang war with the Killeens and the Mullins. Would they have taken advantage of it? Would they just done something to stop the violence? But eventually, I think had Buddy had lived, they would have taken over Southie, and I really believe they would have killed Bulger. I don't see him living.
What? How long do you think the organization would have lasted after that under his leadership?
I don't see. I think no. I don't believe they would have fallen into that whole horse racing fix because they did that out of necessity, from what I understand. They were hard up for money, and this guy Anthony Chula came to them and said, I can fix races, blah blah blah. But I don't see them falling for that. But I don't see them getting past the 70s. I think it would have peaked in the 70s. I think some key guys would have went away, and who would have been left? I don't know, because this was all pre-drug. The drug era didn't hit to the 80s. Mm-hmm. Who would have been left to put that together or to take over? Whoever it was, I just don't see Bulger. Maybe I think Flemmi definitely would have lived. I could see him falling in line with everybody in Somerville. He ended up getting along with them after 65 and signed on their side of the war and killed a lot of Mclaughlins for Somerville. Mm-hmm. So I see him falling with them. I don't see Bulger. I just don't. And maybe Flemmi would have taken over South Boston like he tried to in the late 60s. Maybe Buddy would have backed his move, and that would have been that. But Bulger wouldn't have been there, and if he wasn't that position, then how did things change? Guys like Halloran might have been alive. The guy that was killed at Halloran, who was an innocent guy, would still be alive. A lot of guys would still be alive. A lot of guys may not have gone to prison. You got to understand another thing, that Bulger and Flemmi were informants for the FBI prior to the Angiulos going away. So Flemmi was the one that more or less drew a picture of Jerry Angiulo's office, which was called the Doghouse. I think it was 99 Prince Street in the North End. This is where Jerry sits. This is where they talk. So he told them where to put the wire or where it would be good to put the wire, and he sold them out. If he wasn't there to sell them out, if he wasn't an informant, I don't know how that would have worked. Would the Angiulos have gone longer? There's just a lot of things I really wonder about.
Or what would have happened had he not split from Flemmi and instead followed him into LCN? Yes,
that's exactly. They were begging, from what I understand, Larry Zanino was begging Flemmi to be made. And I always wondered if Flemmi was always for it. Oh, yeah. But Flemmi was, excuse me, Flemmi was always for it. Flemmi was not. And why did I always wonder, why didn't he want to? Wasn't that everyone's, if you were an Italian criminal, wasn't that your utmost want? I guess. I don't know.
I think the Irish gangs were less hierarchical, less structured, less
Yep.
rules and regulations, did not have the elaborate
Protocols, more or less. Yeah.
yeah, and
And
this would be
right.
easier for him to function.
Yeah.
You have
He
more
would have to
autonomy
kick out
in.
money to a certain guy, or the money's his. So you're absolutely right about that. So I guess that does answer that question. But let's say he did follow into it, and who knows? Now, what's interesting, and I'm pretty sure you know this, but I think it's worth mentioning that Jimmy Maturano ended up getting made, and so he was with Winter Hill in the '60s and '70s, and then he got made in the '80s with Frank Salemi, became a captain, and there's a story with Jimmy that he had a piece of the New Kids on the Block, and the story. I don't know. Have you heard that? Did you hear that?
I have not. Dish, dish,
Oh, okay.
dish.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know, Maurice Starr was
Yes.
their producer. They created them, and I've definitely heard from pretty legit sources that Maurice Starr took a large loan from Jimmy Maturano in the '80s, mid '80s, and so when they got big, he didn't pay. I forget. I don't know the specific. Loan wasn't paid off. When they got huge, Jimmy was looking for his portion of a cut, something, and I don't know. I was never able to figure out, did he get a cut? But I know he tried to. And Jimmy wasn't the type, he wasn't Bulger, where he would just come in and say, hey, we dealt with each other 10 years ago. Now you're doing good, so you got to pay me. He would seek it out if he legitimately had a right to do so. He was Jimmy was a Boston College graduate. He was, why he ever followed his brother into crime, I don't know. He was a very smart guy. So I do believe that story that he gave Maurice Starr a loan. I don't know how Starr paid it, but I do know he made good somehow. I just don't know how.
It, to think of all the all that they're screaming, squealing teenage fans back then didn't know.
Yeah, yeah. That
That's
exactly.
that's
That I think
amazing.
that is very funny to think about where things lead. You follow the crumbs back. Where do they go? And that always cracked me up.
Yeah. Oh, I'm trying to think of other things. Where what actually happened to the Patriarchas in Boston after the Angulo bust? I assume they were basically gone.
The Angelos were their regime. They were their main thing was numbers. They had a huge numbers set up, and he made a ton of money off that. And when he came Boston, obviously Jerry got cuts. In the Boston area, there were about 5 captains, 5 crews: East Boston, Chelsea,
Mm-hmm.
Revere. I believe there were 2 in the North End. So they all kicked up to Jerry. There was a lot of money. To answer your question, after he went down in '84, convicted in '86, um, that's it was an era of a lot of confusion because, as you probably know, Patriarcha Jr. tried to take over the whole organization. Because remember, Patriarcha died in '84, so '84 was a big year. The Angulos go, Patriarcha dies. It's a lot of confusion. The East Boston crew with Joe Russo, they wanted to step up. They thought they should be boss. East Boston always had an issue with North End with the Angulos. Some guys from East Boston were never even allowed into the North End.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, there was issues. But as far as who was boss in the North, it's a little murky for me. That I don't know until um, Salemi comes on the scene
Mm-hmm.
later. Salemi did what, 15 years? He got out in '88.
Mm-hmm.
What always surprised me is he wasn't made until he got out. and then he became boss like the next day. Like not really, but I'm saying very quick rise, very quick rise.
Yeah.
Here he is in by 91, he's making moves, and Boston in the 90s was very confusing because there were still a lot of crews. There was what they called the Medford crew. These were young kids, headed by a guy named Anthony Barry. They had some future in these were teenagers, 20s, and some of the Medford crew ended up becoming made in the 90s and LCN. So Boston in the early 90s was very different. There was another gang war between the Patriot. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but Flemmi, there was a crew out of Burlington, this guy named Paul D. And actually, Paul D's nephew was one of the guys that killed Bulger. Him and a guy from Springfield killed Bulger. So Paulie D's nephew killed Bulger in prison. So there was quite a few crews still fighting around, but Flemmi was running around, planting flags. He had a large, although he was an LCN boss, he had a large Irish crew. He met a lot of Irish guys in prison. Richie Devlin, Richie Gillis. These are some real tough Irish guys. I mean, straight killers. Richie Devlin put a hatchet in a guy's chest and threw him in the Boston Harbor when he was like 19. These are crazy guys. And Flemmi surrounded himself with them, not Italians. And that upset a lot of people, and especially East Boston guys. There was a lot of issues.
Yeah.
It was things shifted quickly. And people were, Flemmi was shot at. I'm sure you know about that. He was shot at. And guys like Gigi Portala, who shot at him out of Revere. Everyone was battling each other. And they just didn't think Frank Flemmi was a legitimate boss. And I get it. I understand why. He sat out for 15 years and comes home and expects it.
Now, what do you think they would have done had they known at the time who'd set up Angulo?
Say that one more time. What do I think they would have done at the time if Flemmi?
And they knew of Bulger and Flemmi's role in the Angulo bust.
I truly believe if they could have confirmed it, they would have absolutely killed them. Now, the next crew, when the Angulos went away, like I said, there was the East Boston guys. There were North End guys like Vinny the Animal Ferreira, Dennis Champagne, Lepore. There were guys like that were left around, Sonny Mercurio, and they were actually openly questioning Bulger and Flemmi. They actually were the first who put out in the streets, we believe these guys are informants. They didn't want to do any business with them. And who ended up putting them on the map with the FBI was Bulger and Flemmi. They, Sonny Mercurio helped. He became an informant. But I'm sure you've heard about how the FBI was able to wiretap the first mafia induction ceremony ever.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of that did go back to Bulger and Flemmi pointing fingers, saying, these are the guys you want to follow, and, this is who you want to do. And so I always wonder, had they remained on the streets, had Vinny Ferreira remained on the streets, Lepore, all of them, would they have eventually killed? Because they were the ones who first said it. Would they have followed through? I don't know. But it just seems funny. They were barking it, and then they ended up getting arrested. But like I said, but they either killed you or they had you arrested.
Well, what about some other forgotten names, like Billy Barnowski?
Oh, yeah, Billy, yeah.
The man with the French surname, the drug dealer, Lapierre.
Oh, Frank, yeah.
Yeah.
Frank, yeah. He was
so many minor players.
Yeah, well, Frank was actually a large marijuana dealer. He made a lot of money for Bulger.
Bulger, but I guess you'd say his legend, his notoriety is kind of non-existent compared to the better known characters.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he wasn't, I hate to say mafia. He was more or less an independent Italian guy doing his own thing, and that left him open to be shaken down, to be taken advantage of. and he was bringing in a lot of drugs. Same thing with out in Charlestown. God, the guy's name is Joe Murray. Joe Murray was bringing in a lot of marijuana in Charlestown, and he happened to, I'm not sure if you heard this, he happened to actually store the drugs on D Street in South Boston, and Bulger found out about it and flipped out and charged him a huge premium because, God forbid, he put it in a warehouse in South Boston and not tell him. But Murray was the big drug dealer over in Charlestown. He had the Celtic Tavern, or Celtic Tavern, I believe they called it. But yeah, I mean, guys like that. Barnowski was original Somerville. He was a Howie Winter guy. He had Howie had.
He has a Polish surname.
I know that's what I was. But Billy was a tough guy, from what I understand. He was definitely involved in that whole horse race fixing guy. He was the guy that would beat the hell out of the jockeys, and he was the one who wanted to kill the jockey and leave him on the stretch at Suffolk Downs as a warning to the other. He was a very violent guy, but he would be beating up these little jockeys and really beat the hell out of them.
That sounds like something out of a Family Guy episode.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was so many other guys. I don't know if you ever heard about Eddie Connors. He was a guy that they killed in the 70s, and he was a ex-boxer. He was a good boxer, but he ended up just owning a bar in Dorchester, the Bulldog Tavern, and he helped Winter Hill. This is the 2.0 Winter Hill. Howie, Jimmy Sims, Joe McDonald. He set up a guy for them and called them and said, "Hey, he's at my bar now. He'll be leaving at a certain time." So the guy left. They were waiting for him. They shot him, and he ended up bragging, "Oh, hey, I helped Winter Hill. I did this." So they ended up killing him. And did you ever hear the story of how that happened? They lured him. Okay, so that was a big hit. That was a big one, and a lot of people weren't happy with it. Eddie. Was a loved guy. Eddie. A lot of people did like Eddie, and they weren't happy.
Oh, and that kind of winds down our episode for the evening. It seems you have many, many stories to tell. Would you care to return at some point?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
We can do that. For now, I'm going to end the episode. I'd like to thank our guest, James, for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
It's no problem. And I'd like to thank whoever takes time out of their day to listen to this. Take it easy, everyone.